In 378 AD, Rome fell in the very hands of the people it called barbarians. But who were these people who brought the mighty Roman Empire to its knees? They were the Goths. Before we dive into who the Goths were and how they defeated the mighty Romans, subscribe to this channel to watch more of history's captivating stories. The Goths first appeared in the pages of history during the 1st century. CE, Roman authors like Tacitus and Pliny the Elder mentioned a tribe called the Gutones or Gotones, living along the southern shores of the Baltic Sea in what is now Poland. But those few lines in Roman books reveal little about their true origins. Centuries later, a Gothic historian named Jordanus told their full story. According to Jordanus, the Goths came from a northern island called Scanza, which was believed to be Scandinavia. From this island, they were led by their king Berig to sail across the sea in search of a new home. When they landed near the mouth of the Vistula River, they built their first settlement and called it Goths Kanza, a name that carried both their origin and their hope for a future. But their journey did not end there. The Goths kept moving. From their home near the Vistula, they pushed southward along the river valleys of the Vistula and Bug. By the 3rd century CE, they reached the vast steppes north of the Black Sea, in the lands we now know as Ukraine and Moldova. Here they met Sarmatian nomads, Dacian farmers, and other tribes that had called the steppe home for centuries. The Goths blended with them, and together they built a new culture which archaeologists call the Chernyakov culture. But soon, the Goths grew strong and became overlords in this territory. Their leaders fought and conquered neighboring tribes, the Ulmarugi, who lived along the Baltic, and even the Vandals, whom they conquered as they marched south. Each victory became a part of their many conquests to come. The first time the Goths collided with Rome was in the 3rd century CE. It was a time when the Roman Empire was crumbling from within. The Goths seized this moment of weakness and crossed the Danube frontier to strike Rome. In the Battle of Adrianople in 251 CE, a Gothic army, led by King Neva, invaded Roman lands. The Romans fought back fiercely, but still the Goths defeated them. Emperor Decius and his son were killed in battle. Rome suffered a humiliation that shook the empire to its core. That day proved to the Goths that they were strong enough to conquer even mighty empires, so they intensified their attacks on other cities. They plundered the Balkans. They sailed across the Black Sea, raiding deep into Greece and Asia Minor. In 268 CE, some Gothic forces even reached Ephesus, where they sacked the Temple of Artemis, one of the wonders of the ancient world. This continued throughout the 260s, until one day Rome struck back at the Battle of Nisus, modern Niš, Serbia, in 269 CE. The Roman army was led into battle by Emperor Claudius II, who was later called Gothicus. The Goths fought with the same fury that had destroyed Decius years earlier, but this time the Roman army held firm until they won. Tens of thousands of Goths were killed or captured. Rome celebrated its victory, and Claudius II was hailed as the savior of the Balkans. For a moment, the Gothic raids were checked, but the Goths were not erased. They remained and kept invading the lands beyond Rome. When Claudius died, Emperor Aurelian inherited a weak empire. Aurelian abandoned Dacia, the Roman province north of the Danube, since the land was too far from secure frontiers. The land was left empty, but it did not stay empty for long. The Goths and their allies moved swiftly to occupy it. The Roman Empire could not fight this. It had to quietly admit that it could not control everything. With this settlement, the Goths' place in history grew stronger. By the mid-4th century, a powerful Gothic king named Germanic rose to power. No one knew exactly where his kingdom began or ended, but his influence was legendary. For centuries, even in Norse sagas, Germanic was remembered as a mighty conqueror whose power stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. His kingdom represented the height of Gothic strength. By the dawn of the 4th century, the world of the Goths had transformed. They were no longer the restless sea raiders from the north. They had now become settled agriculturalists on the rich soil of Dacia. Slowly, the scattered tribes began to unite. From this growing unity, two great branches emerged. To the west, in the forests and valleys of Transylvania and along the Dniester River, lived the Tervingi, the forest Goths. To the east, across the wide steppes stretching toward the Don River, rode the Grötungi, the steppe Goths. These names reflected their geography more than their blood relations, yet they marked a turning point. The two paths that would one day become the Visigoths in the west and the Ostrogoths in the east. While they lived on Roman lands, the Goths were never isolated from Rome. They traded grain, furs, and iron for Roman goods and gold. When Rome needed soldiers, Gothic men crossed the Danube to fight as mercenaries, learning Roman ways of war. The warriors of the north were becoming more than raiders. They were neighbors and allies of Rome. Yet even as the Goths began to settle and grow, they did not enjoy peace for long. The Huns came from the east and crashed into the Gothic world. In the year 376 CE, the Huns swept into the lands of the Goths and shattered their peace. The first to fall were the Grötungi, ruled by their aged king Germanic. The Huns shattered his realm, burning his towns and breaking his armies. Unable to bear the pain of defeat, Germanic ended his own life. His people were enslaved and forced to serve the Huns under the command of the mighty Attila. To the west, the Tervingi, the forest Goths, watched the disaster unfold and knew they would be next. So they fled. They trekked south toward the Danube River. Upon getting to the bank of the river, they begged Rome for refuge. Emperor Valens of the Eastern Empire agreed to let them in as foederati, allies who would serve Rome in return for land and safety. But once inside Roman territory, their dream of safety turned to betrayal. The Roman officials who managed the settlement were greedy and cruel. They starved the Goths, forced them to buy rotting dog meat for gold, and even demanded their children in exchange for food. The cruelty reached its peak when the Roman governor Lupicinus tried to trick and murder the Gothic leader Fritigern at a banquet. Fritigern escaped, but the Goths got very angry over this act, so they rose in open revolt. And for 2 long years, from 376 to 378, they ravaged the Balkans. They killed the Roman patrols and raided deep into the empire. At last, Emperor Valens decided to end this rebellion himself. This led to the bloody Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE. On August 9, 378, Emperor Valens led his army of about 20,000 men to battle against the Goths near Adrianople in Thrace. At first, The battle swayed back and forth. Then, like thunder rolling across the plain, Gothic cavalry, joined by Alan horsemen, swept in on the Roman flanks. Instantly, the battle turned bloody, and the Goths started to win. By nightfall, 2/3 of the Roman army lay dead, including the emperor, whose body was never found. The Battle of Adrianople was a disaster that Rome had not seen in centuries. In the ruins of defeat, the Eastern Empire was leaderless and vulnerable. A new emperor, Theodosius I, a talented general from Spain, rose in this chaos. Theodosius chose peace. In 382 CE, he signed a treaty with the Goths, allowing them to settle within Roman lands in Moesia and Thrace as foederati. They would serve in Rome's armies but live under their own chiefs with their own laws. For the first time, an entire foreign nation lived within the empire, not as slaves, but as partners. They were called the Visigoths, the Western Goths. For the next decade, the Visigoths coexisted uneasily with the Romans. Gothic soldiers fought bravely for Theodosius, even helping him win at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394 CE. Among these soldiers was a young Gothic commander named Alaric. He was loyal to the Romans, but he also nursed his own ambitions. When Theodosius died in 395, the empire was split between his sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. But neither of them was strong enough to rule. Their reign shattered the long-standing peace between the Romans and the Goths. Promises made to the Goths were broken, and Alaric was denied the Roman generalship he desired. Betrayed, he turned away from Rome and was chosen as king by his people. He led the Visigoths out of Thrace into Greece, plundering cities in Achaia, but sparing the churches. The Eastern Romans, unable to defeat him, tried to buy peace by naming him a Federate commander in Illyricum. But that only brought him closer to the Western Empire. In 401 CE, Alaric made his move. He crossed the Alps and marched straight into Italy. And for the first time in centuries, Italy was invaded by foreigners. In 402, the Roman general Stilicho fought him at Pollentia and Verona, forcing the Visigoths back, but never truly defeating them. The Goths remained restless and homeless, caught between serving Rome and surviving it. In 408, everything changed. Emperor Honorius executed Stilicho and massacred the Gothic families who had served in Roman garrisons. Thousands of Gothic soldiers deserted the Roman army and joined Alaric. Now that he had more forces, Alaric demanded land and a Roman command, but Honorius refused. Finally, in 410 CE, betrayal within the city opened the Porta Salaria gates, and Alaric's men entered the Eternal City. For 3 days, the Visigoths sacked Rome. They took gold, food, and captives, but spared many churches and sacred relics. Across the empire, the news struck like thunder. But for the Goths, it was vindication. After centuries of being called barbarians, of being used, betrayed, and starved, they had finally forced Rome to look at them as a people who could no longer be ignored. While the Visigoths were carving out their kingdom in Gaul and Hispania, the Ostrogoths were trapped under Hunnic rule. For decades, they lived as vassals under Attila the Hun. But when Attila died, in 453 CE, the tribes that had once bowed to him rose in rebellion. At the Battle of Nedao, in 454, they united under King Ardaric of the Gepids and crushed Attila's heirs. But instead of fighting for the scraps of the fallen Hunnic realm, the Ostrogoths turned their gaze south toward the Roman world. The Eastern Emperor Marcian welcomed them as federates. He gave them new lands in Pannonia, modern Hungary, and the Danubian region in exchange for their strength in battle. There, the Goths settled under the Amal dynasty of three brothers, Valamir, Theodomir, and Vidimir, who ruled jointly. And in this new dawn, Theodomir's wife gave birth to a son named Theodoric, a child who would change the destiny of the Goths. As Theodoric grew, he was raised in two worlds, the wild Gothic camps and the shining palaces of Rome. At 8 years old, he was sent as a hostage to Constantinople, a promise of his father's loyalty to Emperor Leo I. There, he studied Latin and learned how the Romans ruled. When he returned to his people as a teenager, he was both a Gothic warrior and a Roman-trained leader. By the time Theodoric reached manhood, the Balkans were crowded with restless tribes and mercenary armies. Theodoric fought bravely, sometimes against Rome, sometimes for it, but always for the good of his people. His fame grew until even the emperor could not ignore him. By 484 CE, Theodoric was made a Roman patrician and consul, one of the highest honors in the empire. By the 480s, after the death of his rival Gothic leader, Theodoric Strabo, Theodoric the Amal became the sole leader of the Ostrogoths in the Balkans. The Emperor Zeno feared his growing power, but could not control him. So he offered Theodoric a deal. He told him to march west and take Italy for himself in his name. At that time, Italy was ruled by Odoacer, the Germanic soldier who had dethroned the last Western Roman emperor. In 488 CE, Theodoric led his people across the Alps. They fought their way through Isonzo, Verona, and finally Ravenna, Odoacer's stronghold. They laid siege on Ravenna for 3 long years until it finally surrendered in 493. Theodoric invited Odoacer to a banquet as a show of peace, but Theodoric struck down Odoacer with his own hands at the banquet table. This brutal act brought an end to Odoacer's reign. Theodoric entered Ravenna as king of Italy, ruling in the name of the Eastern Emperor, but wielding true power himself. For the next 33 years, Theodoric the Great built a kingdom where Romans and Goths lived side by side. Beyond Italy, Theodoric acted as a guardian of the West. He united the nations by marriage. His daughters wed the kings of the Visigoths and Vandals. His sister married a Frankish king, and his kin tied him to the Burgundians. His influence stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube. When his Visigothic son-in-law, Alaric II, was killed by the Franks at the Battle of Vouillé in 507, Theodoric became regent for his young grandson, Amalaric, extending his protection into Spain and Septimania. By the 510s, his realm spanned Italy, Sicily, Dalmatia, and beyond, the largest and most stable kingdom the West had seen since the fall of Rome. When Theodoric the Great died in August 526 CE, he left his kingdom to his young grandson, Athalaric, with his wise daughter, Amalasuntha, as regent. But without his steady hand, the kingdom would not last. Though Amalasuntha was an intelligent woman who tried to continue her father's legacy of peace through wisdom. But her own people, the Gothic nobles, conspired against her. Still, Amalasuntha ruled bravely amidst this tension. But when Athalaric fell ill and died in 534, Her last tie to the throne slipped away. Alone and surrounded by men who doubted her, she made a desperate move. She elevated her cousin Theodahad as co-ruler. It was this choice that led to her death. Theodahad was hungry for power. Within months, he seized control, locked Amalasuntha away on a lonely island in Lake Bolsena, and in 535 CE, he ordered her death. When word of her death reached the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian I in Constantinople, he seethed at this betrayal. Her death gave him the pretext he needed to reclaim Italy. That same year, Justinian's greatest general Belisarius crossed the sea with a Roman army. First, he swept through Sicily, crossed into Italy, and captured Naples after a long siege. The Gothic kingdom began to crumble. Theodahad fled at the sight of this danger. His own people turned on him and executed him. The Goths then chose a new leader, Witiges, a soldier of courage, but he too was not strong enough to face the storm Justinian had unleashed. From 537 to 538, the Goths surrounded Rome, hoping to starve Belisarius into surrender. But Belisarius was a master of defense, so he held the city firmly. By 540, he marched into Ravenna, the Gothic capital itself. King Witiges surrendered and was taken prisoner to Constantinople. For a brief moment, it seemed the Ostrogothic kingdom had collapsed, yet the Goths were not finished. In 541, a young man named Totila rose to lead the Goths, giving them hope. He was both a warrior and a reformer. He dreamed of a new Gothic kingdom born out of balance and mercy. But dreams, no matter how noble, cannot outrun an empire forever. By 552, Emperor Justinian sent a massive army under his general Narses into Italy. At the Battle of Tagenae, also called Busta Gallorum, Totila's army was crushed and Totila was killed, his vision dying with him. Still, the Goths refused to surrender. Their new king, Teia, gathered the remnants of their strength for battle. At Mons Lactarius near Mount Vesuvius, the Goths faced Narses one final time in 553. They were defeated again, and by 554, the Ostrogothic kingdom was gone, leaving only their Visigothic cousins in Spain to carry the Gothic legacy into the following centuries. When the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy fell in 554 CE, it looked as if the story of the Goths was over. But one branch remained, the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania. From their capital in Toledo, in the heart of Spain, they refused to vanish. They carried the Gothic name like a burning torch, and over the next century and a half, they would not only survive, but rise to heights that their Ostrogothic cousins had never achieved. In 568 CE, the Visigothic king Leovigild ascended the throne at a time when Hispania was fractured. Rebels ruled in their own territories. The Suebi kingdom stood stubbornly in the northwest, and the Byzantines seized the coastal footholds in southern Spain. Slowly, Leovigild united the land. In 585 CE, he subdued the Suebi and Galicia under his rule. He crushed rebellious local dukes and rivals, bringing much of Iberia firmly under Toledo's control. His wars were brutal but effective, giving the Visigoths, for the first time, a clear claim to rule the peninsula as a whole. But Leovigild wanted more than victories. He wanted to turn its kingdom into something that would last for centuries. So he began to act like a Roman emperor. Under his reign, the Visigoths began to look less like wanderers and more like rulers of a true nation. But his reign was sullied when his son, Hermenegild married a Frankish Catholic princess. Hermenegild rebelled against his father, declaring himself champion of the Catholic cause. Leovigild fought his son and locked him away. But Hermenegild refused to give up his new faith, and for that he was executed. Years later, the church would call him a saint. This was a tragedy that broke Leovigild's heart, even until his death. After Leovigild's death, his other son, Recared, took the throne. He had watched his brother die and learned from the tragedy. He knew that no kingdom could last when its people were divided by faith. So, in 589 CE, before nobles and bishops at the Third Council of Toledo, he did what no Gothic king had done. He renounced Arianism and embraced Catholicism. With that single act, the Visigoths and the Hispano-Romans, who were once separated by faith, now shared one church. It was a moment of rebirth. The Visigoths were no longer outsiders. They were now part of the growing Catholic world of Western Europe. In the decades that followed, while Italy was torn by wars and Gaul fell to the Franks, Hispania, under the Visigoths, prospered. From Toledo, kings and bishops built a realm that blended Gothic strength with Roman order. They built laws that outlasted empires. The Liber Judiciorum, the great Visigothic code, brought Goths and Hispano-Romans under the same rule of law, erasing old divisions. The councils of Toledo became the heartbeat of Visigothic rule. Kings summoned bishops and nobles to decide not only on faith, but on matters of law and governance. These gatherings blended the sacred and the political, giving the kingdom a voice unlike any other in Europe. For a time, it seemed the Visigoths achieved what many empires seek: order, unity, and peace. But even as the kingdom grew in strength, seeds of weakness began to grow. The Visigothic monarchy lacked a stable system of succession. Its kings were not chosen by bloodline, but by election. This led to frequent coups, assassinations, and civil wars. Between 649 and 711 CE, the throne became a dangerous place. The same councils that once united the kingdom now gave voice to dissent. And under King Witiza, circa 698 to 710, the fracture widened. When Witiza died, the question of who should wear the crown tore Hispania in two. A powerful general named Roderick seized the throne with noble support, but Witiza's family refused to accept him. They declared their own king, splitting the realm between two rival courts. This division blinded them from preparing for enemies beyond their borders. Across the Strait of Gibraltar, the Umayyad Caliphate had conquered North Africa, uniting the Arab and Berber tribes under the banner of Islam. In 711 CE, a general named Tariq ibn Ziyad landed on Iberian soil. At first, it was just a small raid, so Roderick marched south to crush the invaders. The two armies met near the Guadalete River. Details are clouded by later legend, but sources agree that the Visigothic host was divided. Some supported Roderick and some did not. Roderick's forces were crushed, and the king himself likely died in the rout. After Guadalete, there was no savior. With the nobles divided and the army shattered, the cities were left defenseless. Muslim forces advanced swiftly through Hispania, and one by one, towns opened their gates, some for survival, others for gold. Only the northern mountains kept their freedom, too harsh and distant for conquest. For the first time in centuries, the name Goth meant nothing. No king ruled in Toledo. No council gathered. The people who had once humbled Rome and built kingdoms across Europe were gone, swallowed by history. But even in their fall, the Goths refused to vanish completely. Their law, the Lex Visigothorum, was used by Christian courts for centuries. Their councils of Toledo became the blueprint for how kings and churches were governed together in medieval Europe. The Visigoths were gone as a kingdom, but their legacy built the world of Iberia that came centuries after. And so, from their fall, a new chapter of history began.